stories are never forgotten, really. It's not to say that everybody remembers incrementally how they all proceeded, no, and that there's not necessarily a revised standard version of every story or even every good one. But the amazingly forgiving thing about stories is if you enter into it as a teller or a participant, as a hearer, you don't know where the beginning is, but that becomes the beginning. And the story starts to tell itself by virtue of your willingness to engage it yet again.
Stories, but I really do think stories are everything we do. That storytelling is movement. So anything that involves, storytelling for me is really just like, it's the difference between the top of the mountain and the valley that creates the gradient that carves the stream into shape. And so any moment when two things come together and there's a difference between them creates the gradient for storytelling.
Where can we hear and listen to many, many different kinds of stories and see and feel them in ourselves? I get as inspired by indigenous stories, that are from the Americas, as much as that I do from my own country, and that's hugely opened my imagination rather than closed it down. But I think what you're touching on there is that you do need to feel that you have to have a land that you feel you belong to, even though it might not be the place that you were born into, or that might actually certainly not belong to you in that sense. But I think without some deep relationship with a territory, it's extremely difficult to know how to belong.
So as I'm beginning to tell a story, even if it's from one character's perspective, I always say, how do my stories center relationships over individuals? How can I understand that storytelling isn't a monologue, it's a shared vasculature with a landscape of many, many beings?
No, I mean, a lot of people say to us, oh, we want a new story, or we want to control the narrative, or we want a new narrative. And I'm going, but those are not the kind of stories you're talking about, are you? No, you're talking about a very particular kind of story. And do you have an example of such a story that might speak to these troubled times, or the one that you've lived your life by or struck you particularly in your apprenticeship, for example?
Yeah, I would characterize the ones you're talking about rather than give you a particular example and say,
perfect.
Probably what they all seem to have in common to me is the absence of the voice of authority, which used to be characterized as the God voice. More recently is the narrator voice, and I think in a contemporary sense, it's probably the contentious, disbelieving, disquieting voice. The amazing thing about the clamoring after so-called new stories is that it seems to me that the people who are making the case that such a thing is needed can't make the story. They can only make the case.
Like universalism, that I think that sometimes animism can be problematically interpreted to mean. We live in a topology of differences, and it's important when we're creating stories to create ecosystems of differences and to realize that that's what's going to catalyze really interesting things to come into view.
Yeah. I'd be hesitant about characterizing the project as reacquiring in some fashion or going back to. Right. And the reason I have hesitation about it is because I am not persuaded that every generation that's currently alive today had its glorious intact period.
Yeah.
To somehow, yearn after and reacquire. I'm not persuaded that this is true. I don't think our dilemmas are a decade deep, or a half century deep at all. So that's the first caveat. So as a story is first and foremost an engaged memory, not a remembrance, but an actual unfolding memory.
The hypothesis of myths are framed as stories, not equations. A scientist quantifies reality while a myth teller personifies it. And it's really interesting that science is trying to gather all of these these beings and this information to explain something. And a myth teller is attempting to gather characters. It's really about perspective. And you know, a scientist, if they believe in the aliveness of what they're studying, could be a myth teller.
That stories give you a way of expressing, but also a way of encountering. So much more often than not, we're on the receiving end of what story does, and occasionally on the practice end.
Right.
Right.
So
So you know, the old adage is the best way to get a good storyteller going is for you to begin to tell a story badly.
I'll start then.
We live in a moment where our myths are deracinated. We think we have myths, but they are like uprooted houseplants cut off from soil, from relational context, from mycorrhizal nourishment. And most importantly, they're cut off from the virtuous cycle of decay so that they can melt underground and then refruit above ground as something freshly adapted to our current environmental conditions and social circumstances. Bringhurst says something that I feel is really important, which is, you know, because mythologies and sciences alike aspire to be true, they are perpetually under revision. That truth implies change, implies adapting, updating. Both lapse into dogma when this revision stops. So a lot of our myths and our stories and our religions have become dogma because they're not letting themselves, like ecosystems, shift and change.
That there's a skillfulness in being at home. There's a skillfulness in being able to hear a story that asks of you some kind of radicalized reparticipation in what it means to be a citizen, not of a nation state, but of a real place, not a place with movable, you know, illusory boundaries and different colors on a map, but that the realities of place are murmuring to you. And often your memories are prompted by them unbeknownst to yourself.
World. And as I've written and attempted to revitalize the myths that underpin human exceptionalism and capitalist patriarchy, I always try and tap into the deep rhizomatic realm that predate anthropocentric narratives. So when we think of myths, they're often these syncretically layered cakes of cultures. Like one culture comes in and dominates an older culture and their myths get melded. So it's really interesting sometimes to look at myths as being like lichen. Like lichen is a composite of fungi and algae and yeast and bacteria. And when you look at myths, it's sometimes helpful to think of them as not just being this pure representation of one culture, but being this conglomerate experience of many different cultures meeting.
Because I feel that without some kind of I don't even want to use the word narrative, but without some story that's going to make sense of our catastrophe, and knowing, as you say, the kin feeling of there being ancestors or people that have gone through this catastrophe before, unless we can, you know, have story, or it doesn't have to be one, that can help us go down and still remain human, that we can still carry that fire of being a real human being. It's going to be very difficult as the years increase. It's already difficult. I mean, it's already really, really hard. And the hardest thing is, one, to realize we're in it. You know, it's not something that's going to happen, you know, in 10 or 15 years. It's something that's already happening. And to some people worse than others, obviously.
I think that the problem we have a lot is when we see something that's been harmful, we just want to throw it away. But that's just rearticulating antibiotic culture. And it usually just resurfaces somewhere else in a more insidious way. I think a great example of that is we've pretended that we've thrown away the theology of body and spirit, but it's just been rearticulated as mind and matter in Cartesian dualism.
If you are in deep obedience to life, you will end and life will continue. But man, you really need to live in a place that's fundamentally animistic to be able to pull that off.
Which is, yes, these stories have a mythic resonance. We enjoy them. We enjoy how they connect us to an ancestry and how we know that some of our ancestors heard these stories, but they need to be retold. And they need to be retold in a way that says, well, how could this myth be addressing climate change and ecocide and oppression and racism? And so for me, when I'm retelling a story, it's with the specific aim of trying to understand how it could be freshly adapted right now.
I'm thinking about nuns and monks and mendicants and their desire to leave the world behind in order to achieve some kind of peace of mind and stillness and the rest. And I characterized a prayer that they involuntarily probably back into that goes something like this. So we pray for clarity and we get it, and it's too much. And so we pray for mercy instead, and we get it, and it's not enough. And we pray for clarity then instead, and we get it, and it's too much, and we pray. Okay, that's the kind of, how should I put it, unachieved pseudo story that most dying people that I was lucky enough to attend were living by, if you can call that living.
Prokaryotic cells merged and half digested each other. So we're the product, our multicellular existence is the product of this like transversal fusion of two different beings. And so I think that we can think of storytelling as being about making kin with other stories, merging stories in inappropriate, complicated, incomplete ways, knowing that it's symbiosis that's going to help us adapt right now. It's not
because stories are allies to life. They're not allies to self-determination for human beings.
Wow. Okay.
To that extent, I will go further and say the very best stories are not human. The very best stories give humans a chance to see themselves in there, but they're not principally human artifacts.
And for me, compost is a really good way of thinking about illness, about stories, which is, it's not about trying to figure out what's good and what's bad. It's not about classification. It's about seeing what unruly combinations come together when you put everything in the same bowl, when you put everything in the same pile. And so you take someone like white, conservative Jesus and you throw him on the pile. And then maybe you throw on the actual Aramaic Jesus, and then maybe you throw on your own sensibility and some plants, and then you let it sit, and then you let the weather come through and move through it. And so what it is, it's about opening up storytelling, art making into a collaboration with microbes, with other belief systems, with other beings, and the capriciousness of weather.
The verb to remember literally means to bring back together again that which was once intact and was subsequently dismembered.
Right.
That's the opposite. Not forget. Dismember is the opposite of remember. And there was a primordial state called member. We don't actually use this as a verb any longer, just as an adjective and a noun kind of thing. So remembering has a degree of nostalgia, if you will, associated with it. It's oftentimes involuntary.
I think that the best visionary advice is going to come from beings that are not human. So I'm always encouraging people not to create some kind of new cult or cult of personality, but to start looking at the being that's showing up. And like even in a city, it's like maybe like the pigeon, maybe it's the weed that is managing to sneak up between the concrete. That is the being that wants to teach you.
A kind of unacknowledged wish pattern that we have. Anybody that was raised in the Judeo-Christian tradition or was exposed to it through the consumer culture invariably has this notion that there was a time that was bordering on the perfect, which you could just call Eden, right? And everybody has a notion of this that was somehow true about themselves in their own personal lives, usually some unviolated portion of our childhood. And when you listen to people evoke this idea involuntarily, it's often in the form of restoring, rewilding, reacquiring, remembering. And the assumption is that you were there once. And since you were there once, you can be there twice. And all you've got to do is find the magic formula, get to the magic school, take the magic weekend workshop, whatever it is, the magic ayahuasca, and you'll get there again. And, you know, all shall be revealed and the veil shall be rent properly so, and so forth. This is, you know, I think this is demonstrably, culturally speaking, not there. It's not there. We're insisting that it's there to make the current regime livable. But what if the current regime is not livable? And we're failing to recognize its unlivability, its literal unsustainability, by virtue of our hankering after this idea that once we had it figured out, that once we were living in accordance with these things that you and I have alluded to during the course of the last hour or so. Because that's my suspicion, that the more sort of sepia-toned, melancholic longing after an old intactness you invoke, the less likely you are to find the current order and the spirit work that it requires of us compelling or possible.